myself to those of you who are new here. I am Daniel Mosley. I'm one of the pastors here, and today I get the opportunity for us to continue to look in the Word and to share together as we study the Bible together. So we are in our series entitled Filters, and we have been covering over the last number of weeks. This is part 3 today, and over our last few weeks, we've been covering common types of the filters. This is how we introduce the idea. So maybe what filters did you have around your home? That's where we started this. And so if you went to the common household, you would find, I don't know, the oil filter, the aquarium filter, the AC filter inside of it. And what we said is that filters serve a certain role around the home as a practical function. And one of their roles is that they would trap the junk, the funk, and the gunk, and that it would prevent those things from coming into our homes, into our vehicle, and that is the role of the filter. So we've been using this filter language to set up what we as believers would have governing our lives, that we should have filters in place in our lives. So in part 1 of this series, we started out with the individual. So we're talking about the family unit as a whole, as you'll see in our graphic, but we started, and those filters were meant for you as an individual to have them in place. Let there be lights. We'll hold off just a moment. Otherwise, you guys can see me like this, and we will keep rolling. We'll give another 30 seconds here and see what's happening. Bear with us with technical difficulties. We've been sorting out some lighting issues. Okay, great. So they will work on getting the lighting rebooted, so you may have to reboot the unit. And you guys can see me okay? We're all right. More importantly, you can hear what we have to say today. Awesome. Well, let's just keep going, all right? Okay, so we've been talking about the idea of the filter. So in week 1, I gave you the 5 E filters, and those were great for the individual's life. Now, in week 2, we really brought the weight of this, and when we talked to husband and wife, we talked a lot about a covenant that we had made as a husband and wife unit, and that covenant was to be protected, that we had a blood covenant between man, his spouse, and his creator, his God. And that covenant had to be protected, and so we gave you filters that were meant and designed to protect your marriage. And so this week, what we've been doing along the way is we've been building on the foundation so we can come to the point now where we talk about the family unit. So today we're talking about the family as a whole, and more specifically about parenting within that family unit. So maybe you couldn't be here over the past weeks. Maybe you've missed one of the parts or all of the parts. That's okay. I'm so glad you're here today. The thing that I would challenge you to do is to go onto our website and watch these sermons. Now, I would love to say that you would do that for all of them, but I mean this very intentionally, that this specific series that we're covering right now is so important to your life as an individual, your life as a husband and wife, and certainly as a family unit. And this is the thing that we've been saying, and we believe this, that if you would put filters in your life, that you would have the opportunity to alter your legacy, that you would alter your legacy, and ultimately, by doing that, you would in turn change the destiny of your family. So it's very, very important. And so as we dive into part 3, as we talk about family, as we talk about parenting today, let me encourage you also to go and watch the downtown sermon. So we are one church with multiple communities, but one thing I want you to resource you the best that we possibly can. And I know that as we talk about parenting, that sometimes I may do things slightly different than you, that another may do things slightly different. And so I would love for you to hear both perspectives as Pastor Jim is downtown sharing this message with his own personal stories, his own ideas for filters, and mine today might look slightly different. So if this is valuable for you, let me encourage you to go online, citychurch.life, click the button watch, and look at the other half of what we are covering here today. Let there be light. Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. So what we are doing today is we are diving into the family idea. And so in introducing the topic, as we talk about family, I want you to know a little bit about who I am. It will help us for our conversation today. And so I dreamed of this. One of the earliest things in my heart that were lodged in my heart was this idea of becoming daddy. That one day I would be a daddy. So there were two things that were very important to me as a kid. One, I wanted to grow up and be a professional baseball player who played for the Atlanta Braves. And the second thing is that I wanted to coach my little league team for my kids. Yes. I can sub in for Brian at any point in time, so he says. So those were kind of the things in my heart. So that was the desire of my heart, that I would one day become a daddy. And man, I remember that moment when my firstborn, when Sydney, who is now 7 years old, when Sydney was born into the world, like, that was truly an awesome, amazing experience. I was filled with awe in that moment of creation and what God has done. And man, just it changed my entire world. How many of you in the room are actually parents? Awesome. A lot of you are actually parents. So you know what I'm saying and how your entire world just changes in a moment's time. That who you were before that moment is now radically different because of this little life that has come into the world. And so we had Sydney, and she's 7 years old. And then we had Luke, and he's now 5. And we have London, who is now 1.5 years old. So I have kids named after cities, the two girls. And I assume there's a Lucas somewhere out there in the country. And so he doesn't feel left out of that. But so parenting, we've just had such an amazing time. It's so much fun. It's such an adventure. It's the joy of my heart. It's one of my favorite things that I do. I love being a husband. I love being a pastor here. But man, something inside of me, just the father in me, man, that just is overwhelming. It's consuming. I love my kids. So parenting is so much fun. But those of you who raised your hand can attest to this fact that parenting is also tough stuff. Like, parenting is tough stuff, right? It's difficult at times, and we go through seasons, we go through struggles, we have difficulties in that, but the reality is, and this is the way that my mom used to say it when I was growing up, she's in the room today, and my mom used to say it to me like this, that parenting is like your heart walking around outside of your body. And that this resonates with me so much now, that parenting is like your heart has literally climbed out of your chest, has grown its legs, and is walking around on its own. You feel so vulnerable. You feel like such a place of weightiness in the responsibility of it. But the two things, one is parenting is a joy, but it also comes with our struggles. So just yesterday, I'm sitting and I'm studying, I'm preparing for this sermon, and I'm sitting in my chair in my living room, and I hear my kids. They've been playing in the backyard on the trampoline, and here they come rushing into the house. Daddy, 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 we got to show you something. Daddy, daddy, daddy. And so, of course, they have my attention, and at that moment, I saw it as they said, Daddy, there's a bird in our house. And they had left the back door open, and this bird had, sure enough, it had flown in our home. And man, it just created this joyous moment, this memory that we were having. We're trying to get the bird. How do you catch a bird? Where's the pillowcase? What do we do? How do we get the bird out of the house? And man, my kids are just we're so excited. And my Luke, he's 5. He almost came to the point where he was like, Daddy, please, I just want him as a pet. Can he stay in my room? Parenting is a lot of fun. But we also have our share of struggles. And this is one of those things that I've realized that we all have a different perspective on parenting, if you will. There was a survey done not too long ago with the American culture, and what they were doing is they were talking to moms and dads. And so they polled them. They said, how would you grade yourself on parenting, how well of a job you're doing? And so most of the fathers and the mothers, they agreed on, man, we're an A, maybe we're a B. They gave themselves an A or a B. And then they continued in their poll, and they asked some questions. It's, how would you grade your neighbor and their parenting skills? And how do you think they judged him? So they gave themselves an A or a B, but they gave their neighbors the D, right? And so the interesting thing that happens there is that we all come from different places. That sometimes listen, we know the story of the days are long, but the years are short. Like especially if you're in that young child rearing age, the days are just so long. Sometimes you're just so exhausted, but the years themselves are short. And that time continues to fly by. And we want to be intentional about how we're parenting. We know that everyone has an opinion on it. We know there are a bazillion books that have been written about it. And oftentimes the reality is that mistakes are easier to see through the window than they are the mirror. That mistakes in other people's parentings, looking into their home, it's easier to just kind of look through the window of someone's home and say, man, they have all of these rooms for growth. They're not doing this right. I'm going to grade them a D. Yet if we were to look in the mirror, that's what I want us to do today, that we would be challenged together as we talk. So as we're getting inside of the sermon, as we're laying these things out, as we look at the word together about parenting, again, I want us to understand the idea that we all have slightly different perspectives, slightly different experiences. And so today I'm going to be sharing from my personal experience. Some of the filters will be universal, but some of them are personal for us. And I'll get to that a little bit further as we go. The second thing I need us to do is here's the challenge of a room this size. As I polled everyone, I saw that some 80-90% of you are parents, but yet I know that you're at different stages of life in your parenting. So that's the real challenge. Again, my perspective is coming from early childhood. I'm rearing kids in the early childhood stages at this, but maybe your child has now grown up and has moved off. Maybe they are now a grown man or a grown woman. What does that look like? Here's the thing that I would want to say to you today, and it'll come on the screen, is that whether they're bawling, they're crawling, whether they're walking, they're talking, whether they're driving you crazy or they're asking you to drive your car, that all kids are a gift from God, and ultimately that our role as parents is never done. It's never done. So your role as a parent, wherever you are in the season of life and parenting, is never complete. So whatever stage your kids are, I believe that today there's something to be said to you about how we parent, okay? So let's do this. Let's jump right into our filters. We have a lot to cover today, a little bit of time to do that. So I'm going to jump right into our filters. And again, we've been covering these from these should be in place so that they can trap the junk, so that they can protect, so that they can keep things pure. And that's what a filter does. And so our first one is actually one that we covered last week. You may recall this one. This is the priority filter. The priority filter. And here's the main idea that I want you to get from the priority filter, and here's what it says, that a parent's priority is to gradually transfer a child's dependence away from themselves until it rests solely on God. I'm going to hang out right here for a moment because this is a very encompassing thought. That as a parent, your number one priority as a mom or a dad is to gradually change the dependence from me over to my Father, that there is a baton passing, that there's a trust passing that must take place, that it is a handoff. So I have been in my family, like we have, my kids are now 7 and I'm down in 1, so we have been wiping booties and changing diapers and doing that whole thing for the kids for the last number of years. And I am in that season where they can basically do nothing for themselves, right? They're slowly growing in their independence, but they are fully dependent on their mother. They're fully dependent on their father. But I know my responsibility over time is that I'm to gradually transfer my child's dependence from myself, from my wife, until it relies solely on God. So we teach them to depend on God. And this is a challenge for us as parents. How do we do that? How do we make the handoff? What do we do? How do we resource that? Let me give you some helps today as we go through these filters. Here's the first one of Deuteronomy 6, and here's where the story comes into play in Deuteronomy 6. So Moses, what had happened in Deuteronomy chapter 5, Moses has just had the 10 Commandments come down from God. He's been giving it to the Israelites, and he says, this is the commands that you're to follow all the days of your life. And he even goes in this great little parenting sermon at the top where he talks about what that would mean if they would follow him, how their kids' would follow him. And so here we are, after they've received the 10 commandments. Now we're in chapter 6. And here's what it says starting in verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength." So this is where we started in the priority filter last week, and we said that this has to be foundational, that it must, one, begin with the individual, that it starts with you as an individual, and that he is placed in the right priority of your heart. And then as a husband and wife, then he's placed in the right priority in your heart. And then from that position, then we are parenting. And so here's the question that happens in the priority filter. This is the question that you should ask yourself: is pursuing God modeled as a top priority? So is pursuing God modeled as a top priority in my family? And let me kind of give you the warning signs, the dangers of what would happen here, and why it's so dangerous that we would have him as the top priority and not just a priority, that some investment into Jesus who would be there. So here's what happens: the dangers of parents loving just a little bit. So one of the most dangerous things that you can do is have a fragmented, partial relationship with Jesus, so that you have this lip confession, but there's a gap between what you say with your mouth and where your heart aligns. Here's the problem with doing that. So think for just a moment about let's say the flu, okay? So think about a flu shot. So people go every year, so once a year, they go to their doctor, they go to the pharmacy, they go down there to Walgreens, and they get their flu shot. Now, what are they doing when they get their flu shot? They're getting a vaccine into their arm. There's some things that are inserted into the body, and what's in the flu shot? The flu is in the flu shot. But why don't they get the flu? It's because it's a limited exposure to the strain that year, correct? Right. And so what happens is, by giving them exposure to just a little bit of the flu, then they become numb to the entire thing, that they become immune to that strain of the flu virus. So keeping in that analogy in mind, the same is true when we spend and have just a little bit of God in our homes. So what happens at that point is it's kind of like lip service. We're talking a good talk, but we're not walking it behind us. And so there's a gap between what we say we value and the actual reality of us following God and honoring God in our hearts, in our families, and ultimately in our parenting. So what we're doing in those moments is we're giving them just a little bit of a taste, like here's who the Father is, and ultimately what's going to happen is that we're going to make them immune to realizing the fullness of who He is, because we've painted the picture that this is God and this is what He requires and this is who He's going to be. And so we model that in the home, right? And so like the flu shot, we can't just do that little bit, a little bit where they get immune to it, that we are responsible for helping them to see the fullness of God and who He is as Father and who He is as their Creator. So again, the priority filter is asking this question. It says, is pursuing God modeled as a top priority? So the priority filter. Here's our second filter for today for us as parents, our influence filter. Our influence filter. And here's the thing that I'm convinced of, and this is what statistics will show you, that parents are the number one influencers in their child's life. You're the number one influencer in your child's life. And so we are to lead our children, we're to lead them spiritually, we are to influence them, to leverage that influence that we have. The challenge somewhere comes into play as I think we start out with the best of intentions. I don't think any of us would say, man, let me bring the kid into the world and I'm going to screw up his life. I don't think any of us would parent that way. So what happens somewhere is that we have the best of intentions, and yet we start drifting from that. So even as a parent myself, we have our best intentions, but my wife and I sometimes drift from the intentionality that we need to have, that the influence is there. So sometimes we look to everyone else for that influence. We decide, you know what? Like, I'm going to lean into the education system so that they can train my child's mental capacity. I'm going to lean into the church so that they can handle the responsibility of that. But ultimately, that it is something that we are responsible for, that our influence is the number one influence in a child's life. Let's go back into Deuteronomy right where we left off. So we were in 4 and 5, and here's where it goes into verse 6, and I want us to read a few things here together. Deuteronomy 6, verse 9, and here's what it says. It says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts." So the commandments that I'm giving, these New Testament, a better way, or the 10 Commandments are a better way for us to live. And what he says is that it must be on your heart. So it starts with the individual, it's the husband and wife, and it must already be inside of you in order for you to impress them on your children. So he goes through these other verbs here, and he says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. And I want you to tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. So what he's really doing, he's saying, listen, like, it's a great idea that you sit around and that you have a devotional type thing that happens in your family, but it's so much more profound than that. It's actually as you are going and you're doing life that you look for opportunities, you look for teachable moments, that you share what the Father is about. Maybe it's what he's done in your life. Maybe it's who he is. Maybe it's a character quality. Maybe it's something of how you're to serve another person. But what you're doing is you're to have this written on your hearts. So the commandments of God, the word of the Lord, need to be saturated in you so that later you can use your influence. And as you are going, as you're doing your life, as I'm driving my kids in the minivan to go drop them off for school, we're having conversations about the Father. So as we go, as we do, we would use our influence. One of the most popular scriptures about all of parenting right here in Proverbs. So Proverbs 22:6 says this. It says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." So train the child in the way he should go. And the emphasis here is on that word, train. The emphasis is on the word train. And I'm going to butcher this translation here, but the word train is here. Konik, you get it. So to initiate, dedicate, or train. So this is that word that we're landing into. So what does he say when he says train a child in the way he should go, and in the end that he would not depart from it? So what is he saying to us here? And this word train, actually, it comes from a concept that's old, and it's biblical, and it came from the Israelite culture. So here's what would happen. So a midwife, if a lady was about to give birth and she was about to have a baby, there would be a midwife, similar to what we have today. And the midwife, what she would do is immediately upon the baby being born, is she would actually dip her finger into some stuff, some food type substance. And what she would do is she would rub it on the conic, on the palate, on the roof of the mouth, and she would take her finger and she would rub it right here. And what it would do is, it was an initiation. And so that what would happen is that the baby would then begin craving the nutrition that it needs. It gets that, it kickstarts, it initiates. And so there's this feeding response that would happen. And so in the same way, when we're told to train our children in the way that we should go, that we as parents are the initiators, that you are the one that's kind of in there and kind of doing this little number, and you are to initiate a hunger, a desire in your children's heart. So when you train your child, you're initiating something, the goodness of God in them, and that we initiate a craving that's for true, and that's right, and that's pure, and that's holy. And that by doing that, they'll see the fruit of the Father and realize that he truly is good, and that they would follow him all the days of their life. So we have to lead with intentionality. We have to leverage our influence. We have to influence our children. We're the number one influencers, and we are responsible for. So the influence filter, here's the question that it asks. How am I leveraging my parental influence? So whatever stage of life you're in, it doesn't matter if they're 5 years old or they're 55 years old, that at no season of your life, if your children are here and the parents are still here on the earth, at no season of your life is your role ever complete. There is always a position of influence that should exist. So when you look at the Bible and you look about how it is very particular about how it lays out genealogy, about how it lays out one generation coming after the next generation, and how the laws of the Lord are to be written on the heart, how they're to be impressed upon their kids, how they're to be passed on. And so what is happening in there is, how are you leveraging your influence? So even when they're 55 years old and you're in your 70s or your 80s, that God speaks a lot about the wisdom that you have from the gray hair ages and seasons of life to be investing into the next generation. So we, as parents, wherever we are on the spectrum, we still continue to leverage our influence. And so my question for you is, how are you leveraging your parental influence? How are you leveraging your parental influence? Here's the big idea, okay? Here's the big idea. That God has entrusted you with the care of his kids. They are his kids under your care. Very important here. You'll be accountable for how you influence them. So God has entrusted you with the care of what is his kids. He's entrusting you, and that ultimately I believe that one day I'll stand before God and that I would give an account for how I led my family. I believe that you one day would stand before God and give an account for how you lead your family and how the influence that you have leveraged with your children. Parents are the number one influence in a child's life. Well, let's move on and let's hit our third filter for the day, and this is probably my favorite one, and this is the identity filter. The identity filter. And here's the question that this one asks, is who has God called us to be? So who has God called us to be? And us here is for the family unit. So who has God called us to be? What's at the core of your family identity? Who are you? Who is your family? Is this something that's left loose to be defined by culture and the world around, or are you defining it? Here's what I'm convinced of. That wherever family identity is strong, peer pressure is weak. Wherever family identity is strong, peer pressure is weak. Wherever family identity is weak, peer pressure is strong. See, I believe that there is an attack that is happening on the family unit, that if you thought about the enemy of your soul, that one of his greatest strategies is to get into the family unit. I talked about this last week for us as we serve husband and wife, that the enemy is coming to pound down your door, and he is trying to kill, steal, and destroy from your family. So we are responsible. So the identity that we have actually puts up filters, it puts up boundaries in place that would protect us from succumbing to the peer pressures of the world around us. Your identity, what is at the core of your family? It's unfortunate that I believe that most time when we start conversations like this, that this question is not answered. I don't know what's at the core of our family. I know some things that are in my heart, but we've never agreed on this. My wife and I, we've never talked about this. We've never come to this agreement. And so we just parent out of whatever the mood is or the mode is or whatever it is. What is at the core of your identity? So if I were actually to change this identity and I was to put my own word up here, it would actually be the word Mosley. This would be the word Mosley. And Mosley is my last name. It's my family's identity. It's my bloodline. And my family is to be spoken with honor and reverence and respect. We are the Mosleys. And so what we do is we actually use this as a filter for our lives. Now, this is kind of encompassing all of them, but we have become so intentional in our parenting that we are trying to define who we are as a family unit by our last name. Let me give you a for example. So I have an older daughter, I have a younger one, and my son's in the middle. So let's say that Lucas is picking on his sister and he hits her with something, he mistreats her. Not uncommon for that to happen. The conversation goes a little something like this. Luke, this is not how we were going to treat a woman. We're going to treat them with honor and respect. Your last name is Mosley, and Mosleys do this. This is how we respond. So maybe it's the stretching of the truth, telling a lie. My little daughter, let me remind you that we are the Mosleys, and in the Mosley family, we don't tell lies. The Mosleys are truthful. We're forthright. We are accountable. And so we use language like this that we actually filter with our last name so that as I'm parenting, we're helping to define things so that one day when the time comes and they want to do certain things that might be permissible but not beneficial, I will say to them, what is your last name? What is your last name? I don't care if every other kid on the planet does it. Your last name is Mosley, and these are the covenants that we've made. These are the core values of who we are, and because of that, we filter everything else in our lives. So this is personal and unique for every individual. So while I say identity here, the job for you is, what's your last name? What's your family? What is your identity? What are the values that you will not negotiate on? What are the core things at the heart of who you are? Because if you will define those things as a family unit, then when the storms of life come by, you already have filters in place that are going to protect you. What does that mean? Maybe your kids are already grown through this and you're thinking, well, Pastor Daniel, that's a great idea when your kids are young. Now what? This is still the thing for you. And so even if you've entered into the legacy years of your life, you have the opportunity to redefine where you're going. So I believe, and I'm just being personal here. So I believe that regardless of my family's history and the bloodline coming up to this point, that just like in scriptures that I see where God drops an individual in the middle of it, and from that point forward, entire family histories are rewritten so that generations from now, when the Mosleys are represented in Pooler, Georgia, that they are spoken about with honor and respect, and you know that there's a value of God in their hearts and their life. What is it for you? How have you defined your family? What is the identity filter? So again, this is very personal for us. So the way that we operate, the way that we conduct ourselves is done, based on the season of life that we're in. So for us, Jacqueline and I, so I pastor here full time. We're very busy. You are on the clock when you're pastoring 24/7. My wife is a gifted educator. She works with the gifted education system out in Effingham County, does a tremendous job. She is fully invested into her career, seems to keep getting promoted. There's favor on her. We have 3 little ones in our house, so the days are very long. But already the years are short for us. And so for us, our framework, our filter, our identity might look a little bit different for you, but here's the thing that we are defining. So let me give you some very practicals from my family, and you can rip off what you want, make them your own, however you want to do that. So my family, here's the commitment that we're making, that we would make memories that lead my kids to return back home one day. So all I'm saying is that the end of my goal, that I hope that we have created memories of substance in them that are good and they're quality, and ultimately they would love to just come back and hang out with Daddy. If I've done that, then we've done some things well. So here's the way that we do that. If that's one of the ways that our goals of parenting, and that's just one example, is we are very intentional. We have family nights We have times when it's like, listen, you're not welcome to come over to my home. This is only me and my kids. We're going to order some pizza. We're going to put on a great animated movie. We're going to sit on the couch, and we're going to hang out, and we're going to be family, and we're going to be intentional about doing that. We sit at the dinner table as often as we possibly can, and we have conversation across the table. We go on daddy-daughter dates. I take my 2 daughters out, just me and them, and I teach them the value of one day a boy's going to come knocking, baby. One day a boy's going to want to hold your hand. One day these things are going to happen, even at 7 years old. So we're setting the framework of what's to come. Because you are a Mosley, one day that boy's going to come knocking, and here's how we conduct ourselves. So one day, what does that look like? And so we have family adventures. We go hiking, we go camping, we go digging through the woods, we go exploring. We pray together often, and I don't just mean praying over my meal. I mean praying together. I let them get involved in the praying, and we just go after Jesus together. And we say, what needs do you know of around you? How do we pray for the others around us? We pile into bed together. Saturday mornings are one of my favorite times. We just all jump in the bed on Saturday. My wife cooks breakfast, and we just kind of do that. And then we serve one another. I am intentional about my kids seeing my wife and I serve one another around the house. What we do there together, we serve one another, we honor one another, and I want them to see healthy relationship and marriage. Here's the thing that I want them to take away. Again, these are personal for me, is I want them to say at the end of it, man, it was great to follow Christ. It's great to follow Christ in the Mosley family. That's what I want them to say. I want it to be such a joy, such an overflow, not a burden. I want them to see the joy of the Lord in my marriage, in my home, and ultimately that they would grow up saying, man, it was great following Jesus as a Mosley. So Jesus is at the center of it. Jesus is at the center of our relationship. So just like in Deuteronomy 6, we do where we go through, we sing songs in our house, we're praying with each other, we're encouraging the moment, and we look for the teachable moments. We look for opportunities to teach. There was a place where the Israelites had crossed over the river Jordan, and they had come on the other side, and the instruction for them was to go and find big stones, and they were to take these rocks and they were to set up these monuments, if you will. And what he says is, every time you see this monument, I want you to retell the story of God's faithfulness and his trustworthiness. So what are the rocks in your lives? What are the monumental places in which you have seen God operate? And how are you retelling those stories? So if we're to impress these things upon our kids, if we're to talk about them day and night, and we're to have them written on the hearts of our kids, so what we do is, again, as an example, so my son is 2 days old. My wife and I had been pastoring in Atlanta, a great church there. Started out around 300, at the end around 2,000, a growing, vibrant, healthy church. And what was happening is that God was transitioning our heart, that we were being moved away from that. And so we're sitting in the hospital. My son is 2 days old, and we're feeling this transition is happening. And ultimately, in that moment, we're left, do we stay with what's comfortable, or do we take a risk, realizing that God has pushed us towards risk, and that ultimately the decision was made because one day I want to retell this story when God speaks, that we would have the faith to be obedient. And we will tell this story until my kids have heard it 1,000 times. But what they will hear is that Mama and Daddy stepped out. When God spoke, we stepped out. We took a risk. And here's where God was faithful all along the way. So what I encourage you to do is actually have an identity that invites your kids to help to be a part of it. So one of the things that we do also in our family is that we invite them into our struggles. And I mean this in an age-appropriate way, but we invite them into our struggles. So if Jacqueline and I are believing God for something, we invite our kids to come along and believe God with us. Look at what the Lord is doing. Look at where we are. I'm not sure how it's going to get figured out. Sydney, man, I don't know what Jesus is going to do, but I know he's going to do something. And we will continue to have conversations with them. And what we're doing is we're putting major foundational pillars in their life so that when they're adults, that they will have been trained and that they will be prepared for it. Okay, I've got to pick up my pace a little bit. Next filter, very important, is our shape filter. And this is actually an acrostic. Let me come back to what this is. Here's where it says in Ephesians 2:10, our shape filter. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared them beforehand that we should walk in them. So I believe that God has created each of us special, in that he has created us with purpose, and that he has created us with a shape. And our shape is actually an acrostic, and here's what it means. That the S actually stands for spiritual gifts. Let's keep going. Okay, spiritual gifts, our heart, our abilities, our personality, and our experiences. So that acrostic makes up shape, our spiritual gifts, and this would be beneficial for you. We teach this in our growth track. We help each other discover our shape, but more specifically, I believe as parents that we're called to help define the shape of our kids, and each of those would be unique. The challenge that we have for parenting, and I'm guilty of this too, is our projection tendencies. So you're familiar probably with the concept, but it looks a little something like this. It's maybe you're at a little league and you're at the ball field, and here's the dad that maybe the ball was hit towards his son on the third baseman, and it goes right between his legs, and the dad just goes off like he's on the fence. He's yelling, he's screaming, he's going through all of that, and everybody in the fans looks on, and you know, dude, the kid's like 9 years old, and already I can tell, like, he's going to be a computer programmer. He's not going to play for the Braves. Get over it. But you've seen that guy, and what happens is a projection tendency is starting to happen. So somewhere, somehow, things that were our desires in our heart, sometimes we try to personify them through our kids. So here's the question that the shape filter asks. Is this God's purpose or my projection? Is this God's purpose or my projection? And so I grew up in athletics, and I want nothing more for my kids to come alongside and to do all the athletics, and I want to coach Little League, and so I don't have to take over Brian's position there. And one of the things that I want, but my tendency, the thing that I have to protect against is to realize that God has a unique shape for my children, and that my responsibility is to discover that, not my own projection on them. Okay, so let me move through this, but I want to say to you that inside of this, that when the spiritual gifts come into play, so even at 7 years old, like my oldest, right now, the spiritual gifts, so I'm looking into her heart. It's, God, how have you shaped each one of my children uniquely, and what gifts have you put inside of them? What's in their heart? What is their passion? What are the thing that they get the most excited about? What are their abilities? My kids have different kind of abilities. One is creative, and one can just seem to do everything in athletics. What's their personality like? How about their temperament? And then what experiences are we using to shape them? And this is part of our desire for why we have our kids involved in a local church. This is why my kids are here at City Kids. I love what we're doing here. I love the family ministry of what we're happening because of this. We're helping them to discover their shape here. And so for us, part of that is to making sure that we're pursuing that we're looking and helping to identify and prepare them for the purpose that God has in front of them. So when I was in Atlanta, one of the things that we met this great family that came in, and they were just awesome in the life of the church, and in the forming of this relationship, they came in and they have a husband and wife, and they actually have 10 children. And so in the forming of the relationship, over time, they invited the whole staff over. They were serving us. And something amazed me about their kids, that every one of them, from grown with their own kids down to this, in the whole spectrum, every one of them came and served my family. And I was blown away by this. Like, how did you do this? What is your secret? Please tell me. And I figured it out, not by their words, but by their actions. And I watched this husband and wife, and I watched how they served, and how they put others' needs above their own. And because they were doing that, their family was always invited to serve alongside them. So it wasn't a fragmented thing. It was a please come and serve with us. And that spoke so much volumes to me that that's now what I've adopted for my own family. What is that for you? What does it look like for you? What's the value that you have as you look at the shape filter? I would say the church would be a great place for you and your family to help to discover the gifts. Here's the survey, and this is what it said. So this was of kids who become active Christ followers as adults. And I want you to see the percentages very quickly. So if mom and dad went to church while the children were growing up, 72% of kids would then go as adults. So a pretty strong number there. Mom and dad are in church, kids are coming behind them. If mom was the only one who went to church, then 15% were connected in church. And look at how interesting this is. If dad only went to church, 55% would go. And then if neither mom nor dad, only 6%. So 94% of them did not go. So this is what I want to say to dads as a sidebar. Like, don't ever underestimate your ability to disciple your children. For whatever reason, as men, that we help to shape the hearts in a way that's unique to us. That husbands and wives, you have a unique role, but we, as men, as fathers, there's just something about it. When we say this is what we're doing as a family, this is who we're going to be, we are the Mosleys, we participate, we worship together. I believe that even with my kids being young, that they're already a part of the body of Christ, that they serve a functioning role. And I'm to help them to discover whether you're a mouthpiece, whether you're the hand, whether you're the foot, what is your shape in the body, and how do we do that? So I would say to you, what is your value for the church in the role of discipling your children? And make sure that you see that if you're inside of the church, this is one of the things I see, if they can split apart the unit and neither one of them are coming, then the whole next generation would have been thwarted. Only 6% or 94%. So if the enemy can come into your family and take you out of church, then he's got your generations after that too. That's what that shows me. So how important is serving to you? And I love around here when I get to see, we invite everyone to serve here. If you've been here for a while, we would love for you to participate. And so one of the things that we encourage people to do is serve as families. And I love whenever I come on, and I just wanted to, I know I've been after Brian here today, but Brian and his son Nathaniel, so Nathaniel is what, 12, 13? 8? He is a big boy for 8. He takes after his daddy. But what I see whenever I come on and I see Brian out there and I see Nathaniel serving beside him and they're coming in the parking lot, I'm like, here's a man who's doing it right, who you're inviting your kid to come alongside you, to follow in my footsteps, not because I said so, but to follow because I modeled it. And what did that look like, and what are you modeling when it comes to serving? Okay, so let me move to the next one here, and this is our consistency filter. This is a tough one. So outside of love, that I cannot think of anything that a child needs more than this. Outside of love, I can't think of anything that a child needs more than consistency from you and from your home. So here's what's happening in Joshua 24. So there's a group of people, and they're trying to figure out what they believe. And some, they've been pursuing God with half of their hearts, while at the same time they're pursuing idols and other false gods from the world. And so here on the scene, there's a decision that must be made. And so here's what it says in Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. It says, choose this day who you're going to serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. And here's what I love this statement. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. As for me and the Mosley household, we will serve the Lord. As for you and your household, will you serve the Lord? And so here's the thing about being consistent for us is that, here's the question that you ask, that am I consistent in my parenting? Am I consistent in my parenting? And it goes into a couple different ways this way. One is the consistency in the home environment, an environmental consistency. That as parents, we are responsible for cultivating the culture of our home. That our our home should be a place of refuge, a place of peace, a place from withdrawing from the struggles of the world and coming into an environment that's conducive for health and growth and maturity in Jesus Christ. But sometimes we as parents are still fickle. We're still wrestling with the idea of whether we're going to serve Jesus or not. We haven't made the priority, and so there's some consistency gaps in our home. Let me pose a hypothetical for you, okay? So let's suppose that sometime after church today, maybe this evening, I show up unannounced on your front door and I have my suitcase. And so without your ability to scramble and change your home, I come into your home and I camp out as a fly on the wall for a couple weeks. You're not allowed to change your behavior, not allowed to change the things that are around your home. Just for a couple weeks, I just sit on the sidelines and I just watch. As you engage, I see the content. Like, what if I went over and let's just look at your Netflix watching history? What if we spend some time over in your Internet Explorer or in your Chrome, and we're looking at your browser history, the things you've been going through? What if I listen for a moment of how you speak to your wife, or how you speak to your husband, or how you address your kids? What if I could listen into how your conflict goes? What would that say? What would I learn and discover in that process? And I hope it's a thing of beauty. I hope it's one that just honors Jesus all the way through. But what would it say? How consistent would it be? Now this is hypothetical, and so you might care a little bit about my opinion. It might carry a little bit of weight. But let me remind you of the opinions that really matter. What little eyes, or even grown eyes, are looking on to you as mother and father, and the consistency? So is the declaration of our faith one of just lip service, or is there something in our hearts that's consistent, and then all of the other areas of our life also follow that with consistency? What does it look like? How would that be? What would the home environment look like to be consistent that way? What about consistency in how you do your discipline? How about discipline? And I'm not giving you how to discipline. I'm asking about the consistency in your discipline. So Jacqueline and I, we were noticing something about our kids. We had trained our kids to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir, and no, sir, to treat others with respect and with honor. And I hope that your experience with them has been that. But we were noticing something within our home there, that they were just doing things that just wasn't in alignment with the Mosley filter. And how do we do this? It feels like they were bickering all the time. They're doing what kids do, and it just felt like we were constantly at this place of tension in our home. Our environment was one of tension and not peace. And so Jacqueline and I got in front of the parental mirror, and what we realized is that we had inconsistencies, that we had set a standard and expectation, but we weren't consistent in how we were following through with that expectation. So what that did for them is that inconsistencies, and get this, inconsistencies actually breed insecurities. Inconsistencies breed insecurities. See, inconsistencies or consistency creates boundaries, and then from boundaries we create security. I know exactly where I stand. So when mom and dad are saying one thing, but we actually conduct ourselves in a different way, then there's an inconsistency. The child doesn't know his boundary, and then problems occur. So inconsistency. So I am convinced that when there's inconsistencies, that there is an insecurity, and from that insecurity leads our kids to go looking in all the wrong places, because they're looking to affirm, to find something consistent, to find something real and true, and so they'll bypass the filters, they'll bypass their boundaries in search of that. So unless you want your kids grow up singing the country western song of looking for love in all the wrong places. But if we can be consistent We create the proper boundaries, and then from that we create secure children. How many of us would have not gone down some of the places we went if it wasn't for an insecurity lodged in our heart? So if you're married, here's the challenge for you. Talk to your spouse, decide on your consistencies. What are going to be the identity things for you? And then be consistent in modeling them. You have to embody them, and that you have to present them to your children. Here's our heart filter. I'm going to touch this one briefly, and this is one of my favorites too. I love this whole series, by the way. This is how we do our family, and I've seen the fruit of it. My kids are young. I get that. I know we're going to go through trials, but man, if I can be consistent and faithful, this will help me, these kind of things. So the heart filter, here's what it says in Proverbs 4:23. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows out of it. Everything you do flows out of it. And I believe that as a father, as a parent, that one of our primary jobs is this right here, that we would, above everything else, that we would guard the heart. So you think about the innocence of a child, and you think about how vulnerable they are, and our responsibility is to guard the heart. Let me tell you some practical ways that we actually do this inside of my family. So we inspect the heart, and we do this regularly. Again, my children are young, so your scenario may look a little different. But we do the bedtime prayer time, or we sit around the dinner table, and our questions in the beginning was, hey, how was school today? Everything go okay? And they were just very generic, and you would get the, yep, they're fine, okay. And so what we realized is that we actually have to ask better questions, that we want to be intentional with our parenting. And so let's just come up with different list of questions. And so we start asking these questions, and it's not every night, and it's not always at bedtime, but we ask these questions regularly. What did you appreciate most about today? A value in their heart, of appreciation and gratitude. What did you appreciate most about today? What's something new that you learned today? And here's where we go inside of protecting the heart. Was there anything that upset you today? Did anyone offend you? Is there something that's inside of us that makes us not feel good? Is there anything that you want to talk to mama and daddy about? And so what we're doing will be adopted and adapted based on the seasons of life we're in, but I will always look for a position with my parenting that I want to shape and speak into the heart. I'm going to bypass the other stuff, and I'm going to try to get right in the heart. And so for you, when you understand the value of your identity and who you are as a family, it helps to frame the questions that you're asking, because your questions are ultimately helping to define it as well. Does that make sense? So we ask very specific and pointed questions, that we are guarding the heart. And so even at additional stages of life, so even as a 35-year-old man with my mother now mothering a 35-year-old man, it's still questions of the heart. There's still a place of influence. There's still a place of, let me kind of get all up in your junk. I know how you are with your boundaries. And your kids may say something crazy to you, like, Mom, back on off of me, right? But the reality is they're hearing what you're saying, and it's resonating with their heart. Don't you ever miss the opportunity to speak into shaping the heart and protecting the heart. That God has given you discernment, He's given you wisdom, and He never releases you from the responsibility of parenting and shaping. It just starts to look different in different seasons. Here we go, the failure filter. The failure filter. So this one is about our protection, the failure filter. So somewhere inside of us as parents, we've began doing something where we feel the need to protect, to prevent, to keep our kids from experiencing failure. And so what happens is that because we prohibit them from experiencing struggle, we actually keep them weak from becoming strong as they were designed to be. So let me explain this a little bit further. Here it is in Romans chapter 5, and this starts in verse 3. It says, "Rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, but because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. So what he's saying is that inside is that you're going to experience some trials in your life, and this is actually designed to produce something in you. Now, I know that at this stage in our lives that all of us have experienced difficulty, and I would say that you could vouch for this verse. I would say that in hindsight, you could look back at some of the struggles and conflicts that you faced, and you would say specifically it was these things that actually shaped me, that actually developed my character into who I am today. We see this as parents, yet we deny our kids to experience this sometimes because we want to protect them from failure. None of us want our kids to fail in academics. In fact, some teachers are not even using red ink anymore. We don't want them to fail in their academics. We don't want them to fail in their sports. We don't want them to fail in their relationships. But the reality is that our kids need to struggle. They need to experience some hardships. And here's where you need to take advantage as parents. So right now, I know that when my kids are adults, that one day that they will be on their own and that they will experience some struggle. So my job is to help prepare them. So it's better for me now that under my roof, under my care, that they actually experience pain and struggle so that I can be there and teach them how to respond in those moments. And this is easier for dads than it is for moms, right? But mamas, you got to let your baby experience a little bit of pain and struggle in this life. So here's the question that this filter asks. It says, am I protecting or preparing? Am I protecting or preparing? And let me touch on this idea here, because this is where we get this confused as parents. And this is significant, is sometimes we confuse hurt with harm. Sometimes we confuse hurt with harm. See, as a parent, my job, particularly as a father, is I want to prevent my kids from ever experiencing harm. I protect them from certain things. But at the same time, hurt is not necessarily harm, and hurt itself is the things. Maybe I've been hurt in a relationship. Maybe I've been hurt, but somebody let me down. Maybe I was the last one to get picked on the kickball team. I've experienced hurt, and from my hurt, because we all know that that's a part of life, I have a teachable moment. There's a difference between hurt and harm, and you got to be aware of this. We protect them from harm. We prevent hurt. We allow hurt. We prevent harm. And so don't remove failure and struggle, that we see them through it. And this is where we're getting ready to close. This we could have made into multiple part series. This is why I'm saying to you, watch the other sermon as well, and you'll get even more from what we're doing here. But this is the last one. And this one's the sticky one. This one's weird. It's like, what does this have to do with the parenting conversation? I know it's a bit odd, but we can have idols in our heart. So I know that in the Old Testament, a lot of times you saw idols were like these golden calves, these false gods. They were these images, these physical things that were made. But ultimately, an idol is anything that separates our heart from God, the thing that we place above God in our heart. So our career could be an idol, and our children can be an idol. So we start out, and maybe sometimes it's even a desire to have kids. So we start out, and there's this great desire in our heart, and maybe that desire itself becomes an idol for you in your life. Sometimes we progress along, and now we have our kids. And so let me tell you a few symptoms. So this will help you to determine, and I'm going to hit these fast. It will help you to determine whether you have an idol that you need to be filtering out in your life. So this is how it would kind of go. And I'm not saying that if you have one of these that you've got this problem, but if you find that there are multiple of these in your heart, then maybe there's an issue. The idol filter. You would say phrases like, man, my kids are my world. You talk about your kids in maybe every conversation. You can't stop talking about them. You post your kids' photos on Facebook 17 times a day. You regularly are compromising to please your kid and make them happy. You worry excessively when they're away from you. If your calendar contains more soccer, ballet, and gymnastic events than there are days in the week, if you rarely spend time with your spouse without the kids, and if your identity is in your kids. See, I love my kids more than anything, and I would, without hesitation, I would give my life at a moment's notice for any of my children. So the thing for me is not a matter of am I loving or serving my family well, but the thing for me is to determine where the priority is and who's sitting at the center of this. And so here's the out of balance life. If our lives revolve around our children rather than revolving around God, then we have allowed them to become an idol in our heart. Let's say that again. If your life revolves around your kid rather than it being around Jesus, if it's about them the majority of the time, then you need to kind of get some things in check a little bit. So the question for you is, have my children become the center of my family, or are they leading me? Have my children become the center, or are they leading me? I see the typo there. So here's the closing part. Is that we have the potential, again, as husband and wife, as a family unit, that we have the potential that we would make decisions to put filters in place that ultimately they would alter our legacy. We want to have a legacy that leads our families somewhere. And that if we would make those decisions to put the right filters in place, that it would alter our legacy, and ultimately it's going to change the destiny of our entire future. Parents are the number one influencers. That if you would train your child not to depend on you or even themselves, not even on what they see, but instead that they would depend on God. If we would train our kids that way. So, addressing the room, addressing the parents that are in the room. So all of us are at different stages. And so maybe you are that mentor. So my challenge for you is that you continue to say, God, how am I leveraging my influence? Maybe you are a single mom in the room. I have a tremendous respect for you, and we want to honor you here at City Church. We want to serve alongside of you. Anything that we can do, just know that your church is for you. We believe in you, and we want to be here for you. Maybe you're the parent of a prodigal. Maybe your child is now grown, and maybe you did everything that you knew to do, and you felt like you did that the right way, and now you're questioning God. God, you said that they would return to it, and where are they? What has happened? Maybe your prodigal's out there. Listen, I was the prodigal. I believe in the power of a praying mother. And God hears your cries in the night. He hears your cries for your kids, and that He is one that looks to honor that. And I believe that as we pray together, even today, that He is prompting their hearts. And maybe you're a parent and you've been feeling today, and you've heard some of the things we've been talking about, and somewhere in your heart is this place of guilt and remorse and condemnation. See, I know that there's no such thing as perfect parenting. I know there's no perfect way to do this, and I know that I'm going to screw it up 1,000 times before my kids even hit 18. The problem that we have is sometimes that we continue to crucify ourselves, that we won't come off of the cross, that Jesus has given us an opportunity to do things differently, to ask for forgiveness and to do things. And I'm not saying you don't go there. So if you messed it up, reach across there and say, man, I messed it up. Can you forgive me? Would you forgive me? But from that moment forward, you let yourself no longer be bound by that condemnation, and you seek from this day forward, we have an identity. We are going to be about this. And so do your part. Do whatever you can do there. Could you stand with me as we pray, as we close together? The band's going to come back out, and they're going to lead us in a song in just a moment. Jesus at the center. And this has been our anthem, our song for this series, that Jesus is at the center. So He's at the center of your heart. He's at the center of your marriage, and He's at the center of your family and your parenting. God, I thank you, Jesus. I thank you for the families that we have here today. God, we thank you for your word that gives us instruction. And God, we thank you for the hope that you give us. So Lord, wherever we've been, whatever mistakes that we've made, Lord, ultimately teach us to parent well at whatever season we're in. God, we give you our kids. We release them back to you, God, that they would never be an idol in our hearts, but we would realize that they are a gift from you, that we are being entrusted with them, and that ultimately you are their father. You are their parent. And God, so today we simply just be obedient in faith and say, God, your will be done, that you would be at the center, that God, that you would be honored in our parenting today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.